Happy Canada Day to you too, Kieran.
So let's start with your reaction to this. It wasn't really a surprise, was it, that the U.S. was not going to signal renewal?
No, and what's interesting also is the very fact that Mark Carney was obliged to weave that into his Canada Day speech, of course, as we saw today. And there's a reason for it. Canadians are downright worried about what's happening with the United States ever since Donald Trump came back. Carney, full of energy, smiling, able to calm things, I think, fairly, mentioning the fact that the worst part that could have happened, which would have been the announcement that the U.S. was withdrawing with 6 months' notice, has not occurred. What we are heading into is a lot of instability because businesses looking to make a decision, Kieran, are not going to be thrilled about a trade pact that has to be renewed every year. So built into the decision of the United States is a lot of instability and insecurity, and that's not great for the economy on both sides.
Canada made a bold trade decision that could reshape its future with the United States. Instead of making last-minute concessions, Canada stood its ground and protected its position. While the US opened the door to more trade uncertainty for its own businesses, Canada showed it would not negotiate under pressure. What happens next could change North American trade. On July 1st, 2026, the date the first mandatory joint review of the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement was formally scheduled to open, the United States declined to extend the deal. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer cited the agreement's shortcomings and rejected a 16-year renewal in its current form. Canada had formally requested that extension in writing weeks earlier. The request was declined. CUSMA does not expire. It does not collapse. It remains in force until 2036 under its own terms. But instead of locking in a fresh 16-year term that would have provided long-term commercial certainty for manufacturers, exporters, and investors across the continent, the agreement now enters a rolling annual review process, and Canada refused to make a single concession to prevent that outcome. Jamieson Greer's characterization of CUSMA as having shortcomings that prevented renewal is the American framing of a negotiation that produced no American wins. Canada entered the review with a documented list of conditions for any renewed or extended framework tariff removal on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and lumber, and left the review without conceding any of them. The Section 232 tariffs on Canadian steel remain at 50%. The Section 232 tariff on Canadian aluminum remains at 50%. The 25% automotive tariff on Canadian assembled vehicles remains. The combined anti-dumping and countervailing duty rate on Canadian softwood lumber sits at 34.83%. Not one of these tariffs was removed as part of the July 1st review process. Canada removed counter tariffs only on goods that comply with CUSMA rules of origin, a targeted technical adjustment, not a concession. Prime Minister Carney set the tone for Canada's approach before the review even opened. When asked what he expected from the July 1st date, he said he wasn't expecting any drama. That framing was deliberate. Canada's position throughout the review period has been that the existing agreement remains in force, regardless of what the joint review produces. That Canadian businesses can continue trading under current rules while negotiations proceed, and that Canada will not accept a worse deal in exchange for avoiding the annual review scenario. The annual review scenario arrived. Canada did not accept the worst deal to prevent it. The legal mechanics of what the July 1st decision actually produced are important for understanding why this outcome is not a defeat for Canada, despite the dramatic framing that has surrounded it. CUSMA, known as USMCA in the United States, was signed in 2020 and expires in 2036 unless withdrawn. Its review clause required the three parties to jointly assess the agreement and decide whether to extend it for another 16 years to 2042. No extension was agreed. That means the agreement continues operating exactly as written until the three parties either agree to extend it or one party issues a formal 6-month withdrawal notice under Article 34.6. No withdrawal notice has been issued. No party has triggered that mechanism. The trade framework governing $1.6 trillion in annual North American commerce remains operative. What changes under annual review is the commercial planning horizon. A 16-year extension would have given manufacturers, exporters, and investors certainty about the trade rules governing their capital allocation decisions through 2042. Annual review means the agreement's continuity is reassessed every 12 months, creating the sustained uncertainty that analysts had been calling the zombie USMCA scenario, the agreement alive but never extended. Theoretically at risk of non-renewal every year, without that risk ever converting into actual withdrawal. The Bank of Canada had already projected Canadian GDP approximately 1.5% below its pre-tariff trajectory as a consequence of the trade conflict, a projection that assumed uncertainty would persist. The annual review structure validates that assumption. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc's formal written request for a 16-year renewal, delivered to American and Mexican counterparts before the July 1st deadline, is now a documented part of the public record. It states Canada's preferred outcome. It states Canada's commitment to the agreement. And it states that Canada sought extension without making the dairy, digital services, or supply management concessions that Washington had listed as conditions. Canada went on record wanting the extension. The United States declined to grant it. That sequence is the specific outcome. Canada's negotiating position was designed to produce a situation in which the refusal to concede is documented as Canada's choice, not a failure of Canadian diplomacy. The 89% of Canadian goods exports that currently qualify for CUSMA compliant tariff treatment continue to qualify under exactly the same rules that governed them on June 30th, 2026. The rules of origin requirements for automotive products remain unchanged. The tariff rate quotas for agricultural products remain unchanged. The intellectual property provisions remain unchanged. The services trade commitments remain unchanged. No provision of CUSMA was modified, suspended, or renegotiated in the July 1st review. The agreement is identical on July 2nd to what it was on June 30th, except that it is now in annual review rather than locked into a fresh 16-year term. Mexico's position in the review process diverged from Canada's in ways that reflect each country's distinct negotiating priorities. US-Mexico discussions on automotive content, agricultural trade, and energy investment had been progressing through separate bilateral channels in the weeks before July. First, with American officials describing the US-Mexico track as further advanced than the US-Canada track. Canada consistently pushed back against the idea of a two-track review that would separate Canada from Mexico. The trilateral structure of CUSMA is itself a protection against the United States, applying maximum bilateral pressure, each country individually. That structural protection remains in place as the annual review period begins. The sectoral tariffs that Canada has been demanding removal of steel, aluminum, automobiles, lumber are all imposed under American legal authorities separate from CUSMA's framework. Section 232, tariffs on metals and automobiles, are presidential proclamations under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. Anti-dumping and countervailing duties on lumber are Department of Commerce determinations under U.S. trade remedy statutes. None of these authorities are governed by CUSMA. A CUSMA renewal would not automatically have removed a single one of them. Canada knew that entering the review, Canada's formal renewal request did not link extension to tariff removal because the legal mechanisms are entirely separate. Canada is pursuing tariff relief through parallel negotiation channels while the CUSMA framework, extended or not, operates independently. The Canadian counter-tariff structure remains in place on American goods that do not comply with CUSMA rules. Canada has applied 25% retaliatory measures on selected American steel and aluminum products, covering the categories most directly affected by American Section 232 action. Those counter-tariffs were not removed as part of the July 1st review process. They were not offered as a concession to secure extension. They remain active. Canada's retaliatory posture going into the annual review period is identical to its posture on June 30th, which is to say, it is the same posture Canada has maintained since the tariff war began in early 2025. Nothing was given up. The agreement continues. The annual reviews begin, and Canada arrives at the first one having conceded nothing.